The S&P 500 soaring to an all-time high, buoyed by President Trump's comments on interest rates and oil prices. Trump has urged OPEC to reduce oil costs and has warned of potential tariffs for overseas products at the World Economic Forum. For more, we are joined by Rodda from Capital.com, who's in the studio. Great to see you.
Great to see you too.
Yeah, all right. Trump's big week. What have you made of it?
Well, I think markets, broadly speaking, have embraced it, more or less accentuated the positive, and at the moment not eliminated the negative, but certainly put it to one side. And the negative is trade wars and the risk of basically tariffs on China, which Trump has been, maybe surprisingly considered with, and his administration look like they're going to take a sort of slow approach to that. But the things that markets are really embracing is obviously the deregulation agenda. It's also the tax cut agenda, which we got a little bit more colour about last night at Davos. So more or less, it's the reason why the S&P 500 is at a record high as of this morning. And again, investors seem to be a bit bullish again.
It has been incredible watching it just soar over the past week, right? And obviously, as you mentioned, the Trump effect is there. The tariffs could be seen as short-term pain for the idea of long-term gain, listening to President Trump speaking at the World Economic Forum. The idea is you want to do business in America, either cop tariffs or do business in America.
Yeah, I'd probably see it the other way around, actually, where it's short-term gain for long-term pain, on the basis that what it will do is it will basically direct business back into the States. It will also have the effect of protecting US industry, which means that their profits will be supported. The problem with long-term tariffs, or tariffs in the long term, is effectively that they do lead to this tit-for-tat dynamic. They raise costs across the board, and sometimes that can mean a less productive.
But if they comply, if these countries comply, if these businesses comply and do business in the United States, they don't get the tariffs. That's, I guess, what I'm referring to about the long-term gain for the US economy, is that the tariffs is really just a carrot on a stick, to avoid, otherwise you cop them.
Yeah, I guess it depends on how you sort of define long-term versus short-term. Certainly, I think it will direct capital flow back into the United States and drive that sort of investment boom. That's something that might play out over the course of Trump's term. My more concern would be with the long-term tariffs impact is that tends to balance out a little bit, and in the long run you deal with an economy that has a higher cost base that tends to again result in sort of tit-for-tat dynamics as well. So you get these kind of like vicious cycle of higher costs because of higher tariffs being applied back on the US economy as well. Less goods sort of being traded around, costs being higher across the board, which means that generally growth is going to be, and margins are a little bit lower than they would be otherwise, which means less reinvestment back into the economy in the long term. So that's kind of the risk of tariffs going forward out into the future. But I certainly agree that there is going to be a period here where the American first mantra is going to basically boost economic activity, and certainly I think markets are pricing in that the US economy is going to continue to outperform the rest of the world for a little while, not just because of tariffs, but perhaps partly because of the Trump, America first mantra.
Do you think business believes him when it comes to tariffs, or do you think this is one of those, do you think they believe this is one of those Trump things that he's full of bluster at the beginning to get what he wants? He'll probably get what he wants, and therefore we don't have to worry.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of what markets are pricing in. I mean, certainly there was the concern that the 60% tariff might have been an executive order from day one, and Trump might have used emergency powers more or less to try and implement that. He didn't. That's why we saw that really big rally on Wall Street at the start of the week. But I think from the get-go, especially because we have a bit of a playbook from the first Trump administration as to how he does business, is that he does tend to go pretty hard on the rhetoric. He shoots from the hip. You've got to say that he doesn't sort of filter himself particularly much. If there is a question that he's asked and he has a thought about it at the time, it's not necessarily official policy, but he'll give you an answer. So the markets have this sort of headline risk and knee-jerk reaction. But ultimately, yes, there is that belief that he sort of highballs a little bit to an extent, and then he'll kind of meet in the middle ground and water things down a little bit and try and make a deal. So I think that's what markets are expecting to happen. Again, there's always a risk that that doesn't occur, especially if the likes of China and other trading partners don't comply. But I think the markets are expecting a resolution there at some point in time.
One of the things that we're watching closely is energy policy, because that feels completely up in the air at the moment. And it feels as if many of these big banks in the United States that have been lending for green initiatives are going to find themselves very much on the nose, but they lend right around the world, including here in Australia. They prop up the Victorian economy, for example, which is heavily in debt. You wonder how long that will last for, many of these green initiatives, given, as I say, President Trump has made it clear that he believes that traditional drill, baby, drill is the way to go.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's going to be interesting to see how the industry responds without the level of government support, even around like the electric vehicles as well, which Trump has said that he's going to sort of pull back support of to make it an even playing field with hydrocarbon sort of based industries and what have you. So it's a bit of an open question as to how renewable energy and how green projects will go without, again, that sort of, I guess, level of protectionism to try and obviously put forward a climate agenda and climate policy and environmental policy. I suspect that in the long run, because hydrocarbons are sort of obviously a limited resource, and in the long run we're going to have to transition one way to another to different energy resources, that there's still going to be that level of investment there from certain institutions. But I think at the margins, and certainly in the short term, we're going to see that wound back. And certainly, arguably one of the most cynical things that have happened over the last couple of weeks now the Trump administration's come in is that these corporations who at one point in time were literally saying that this is a core value and it's in their DNA to do this are pulling back on it now and feeling much less obliged to kind of support these policy measures. That's going to have an impact in the short term and sort of have an impact on the energy mix. So again, it's a kind of a good time to be in hydrocarbons. It's a good time to be in sort of traditional fossil fuel industries again. They still trade at a discount, probably to fair value. And again, one of the things we've seen over the last couple of weeks is just some bullish sentiment towards these industries because of this changing dynamic.
It's interesting, it's like the United States versus the rest of the world. However, we saw yesterday Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, say that they're more interested in growth than net zero at the moment in the UK, which is very much heading in the Trump kind of aura. We aren't hearing that in Australia, quite the opposite in fact. Billions of dollars for the aluminium projects to try and get them to be using solar and wind power, announced by Anthony Albanese this week. Let's talk about crypto, also a big week for crypto as well, hitting that 109,000 mark. You and I were talking about when it would hit 100,000 and now the idea of 110,000. Trump hasn't really spoken too much about crypto this week. It wasn't mentioned during his inauguration speech. Felt like everything else was except for that, yet the crypto market still reacted positively.
Yeah, I think a lot of it was to do with the Trump coin, and it shows that he has, skin in the game effectively now when it comes to the crypto industry. We've put it on our platform now. People are loving it. It's basically really a gambling chip. There's no fundamental value behind it, but it shows that he's heavily engaged in the space. Again, he has skin in the game. He's already said that he wants to be, the US to be the crypto hub. He's spoken about sort of strategic reserves, which are sort of, kind of weird and nonsensical ideas, but it all shows that he wants to be in that space. I would assess it as being a political thing because he realised that young men mostly love crypto. One of the big voting blocks at the last election was young men swinging very, very towards the Republican Party for the first time in like decades.
Or the Bro Squad podcasts that he found himself on thanks to Barron. It draws back to energy and to China as well, right, when you think about it. So data centres announced this week the $500 billion with SoftBank, the Japanese company, but also with Oracle too and ChatGPT, OpenAI, the idea that we need a lot of energy. We know that crypto requires a lot of energy. We know that these data centres for AI requires a lot of energy too. It all comes together, and when you look at it, it is all pointed at China.
Yeah, a lot of it is basically. And basically, building out the productive capacity domestically in the United States to be the world leader in what's probably shaping to be the most significant industry of our generation. And, if you tie it back into that kind of energy discussion, one of the really interesting developments, a part of this kind of deregulation agenda around artificial intelligence, not just the security and the concern there's going to be an apocalyptic risk to the human race, is that he's allowing a lot of these businesses to set up energy infrastructure within their businesses, within their kind of plants, a little bit like Elon Musk has actually done with some of his Tesla manufacturing facilities and everything like that, is to be able to set up, gas infrastructure, maybe even invest in nuclear infrastructure, all these different things to allow these businesses to have the resources to literally power this extraordinarily energy-hungry industry. And again, make sure that the US is at the forefront of that. So it's a huge part of the strategic landscape. It's a huge part of the economic landscape. It's a huge part of what's going to drive energy demand and climate outcomes and all these things in the future. And Trump wants to be at the forefront of it. And you've got to say that, again, for someone who tends to be fairly mercurial, sometimes is seen as being a little bit opportunistic, this seems to be actually a very ambitious and well thought out policy for the future. It
makes me wonder where Australia fits into all this. Let's bring it back home to where Australia is at the moment, going down a very different path, right? So trying as hard as we can to get away from coal. The opposition is talking about nuclear, which can be politically difficult at times. No one wants to live next to a nuclear power station. Then you've got the fact that they are borrowing so much money to heavily invest in green technology. The states are doing it in the Labor states. The federal government is doing it as well. Power prices are increasing as a result. And it just makes you wonder about advanced manufacturing, how we can be competitive at a time where things are very expensive in terms of power. Obviously, we'll keep our personal views out of it, but where do you see the economy going as a result of that? Because the Australian economy, has so many challenges at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, if we start with the energy security discussion, I think it's going to end up in a situation where at some point in time, whether it's the current Labor government, if it happens to win power again and remains in power for a couple of terms, or whether it happens to be the coalition, which will probably find it a little bit easier sort of ideologically to do this, is that we're going to have to fall back on gas once again to be able to more or less stabilise our...
And the Labor states have been shifting away from gas at record speeds, including here in Victoria.
I think that will change when public sentiment realises that gas prices are higher than they would be otherwise, and energy prices are higher than what they would be otherwise. I was actually having a chat with an investment banker a couple of years ago in a previous life, more or less talking about that, some of the major issues here are actually around these kind of social contract, problems when it comes to energy and renewables that nobody wants it built in their backyard. The problem's getting away from us. Clearly the world's moving in a different direction, and we're going to be increasingly running into issues, especially in the eastern states, where basically energy prices are going to be high. The intermittency of renewables is not going to be able to keep up for our needs, and there's going to be people angry enough within the electorate to say, actually, let's get the energy mix right. Ergo, all right, we're amenable to gas once again. So that's sort of where we're probably heading. As far as the bigger long-term issues when it comes to the Australian economy, that's the issues that we're running into at the moment. Is that we're deeply unproductive. We're clearly a homes and holes economy still, relying on what is effectively at the moment the public sector.
Homes is doing really well because of the government creation of demand by immigration, but the holes part is a bit of a worry, right? Because we are not just seeing the price of iron ore soften, but we're also seeing the United States essentially could become quite a competitor to Australia when it comes to providing resources to the rest of the world with the drill baby drill policy too. Where do you see that playing out, and how does that impact the Australian dollar and the economy?
Well, I mean, that's probably a lot of a China issue as well. And then there's the geostrategic and geopolitical risks associated with that, because obviously we're caught in the big power struggle. So that's going to be a risk to us. The other element is that a lot of our big miners are sort of pivoting towards, copper and these other sort of materials that are going to be far more significant in our future, and will remain more significant in our future. And that's, going to be a big driver of economic growth going forward. There's also the rare earth conversation, which, especially if those geopolitical issues continue to play out, China's by far the biggest producer of rare earths across the globe. If we continue to see US-China tensions ratchet up and strategic competition persist, we're in a good position to provide some of those materials to other parts of the world that don't want to buy from China. So that's a positive as well. But again, the problem is that we're still talking about an economy and an economic model that isn't really fit for a future, that isn't really geared towards high value, high manufacturing or high level services providing. And that's going to be perhaps one of the things that continues to drive this sluggish productivity growth, which is actually the key issue at the moment for the Australian economy, and what everyone's really worried about, from the RBA to the government, even though they don't talk about it. So there's no simple answer to this, because simply
the government doesn't want to talk about it because it is a challenge that has been going on for a very long time. Neither party wants to talk about it, right? Yeah, the productivity issue in Australia is also conflated by the issue that we have 3-year terms, and people get what they want, otherwise they ditch the government. So no one actually has the ability to change things or the desire to change things until it's too late. Are we getting so close to that precipice now that some government is going to be forced to make these decisions? I mean, I remember in terms of balancing the budgets, if you think about it, once upon a time, Labor increased taxes, the Liberals cut spending. When the Liberals got in, they worked out that if they cut spending too quickly, they get turfed out very fast, and Labor gets turfed out for raising taxes. Therefore, immigration became the thing that they both agreed on, and that's where we've now seen, obviously, that impacts productivity, though.
Yeah, I mean, basically, if we look at it, maybe it's just a human nature thing, because it happens everywhere around the world, is that people get complacent after years of doing it sort of tough, or making the hard policy changes that need to bring back good times. We're maybe at that point in time now that we're heading to a situation where we're going to end up in a pretty dire state, in something of a crisis as well, and that's going to be the impetus to change. But we've had such a beneficial period of 20 or 30 years, mostly by good luck, but also the structural reforms that happened through the 80s and 90s, that now our good luck is kind of running out a little bit. We need to make necessary changes once again. So it's going to have to come to a crisis that sort of galvanises the body politic to push governments to make the necessary changes. Unfortunately, I think you find this everywhere, that it's not until a crisis actually happens that action is taken. People, and governments in particular, normally don't do things preemptively because it's politically unpalatable. Yeah, very much so. Look, great to have you here in the studio. Good to see you as always. We're back in the city, so it's much easier to catch up. Good to see you. We'll talk to you soon, Rodda. Thank you. Thanks for having me.